Hey, good afternoon, everyone. This is Matthew. I'll be your moderator this afternoon. Looks like we're just about ready to get started. Melissa, you all ready to go?
I'm ready.
All right, we'll take it away whenever.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Melissa Holsey. Thank you for joining us today for navigating the legalities and requirements for Section 504 students. I am a special projects technician for Visalia Unified School District, but my passion for Beyond SST and SACE has led me here today to share with you all of these great features that these softwares provide and offer school districts. This is a little bit different from how we normally do our sessions in conference. I don't get to see all of your smiling faces, and we can't do a lot of live questions. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. Matt is monitoring those for me, and towards the end of the session, he will share with me the questions that you guys have, and we'll answer those as we come to them. So if you guys are good for it, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So important things to understand. 504 is part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And Section 504 prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. So that means schools, private contractors for government agencies such as the military, businesses or organizations that receive federal financial assistance may have to adhere to 504 regulations. Public schools get federal funding, so we have to fall under the guidelines of 504. Child find is something that we're all pretty familiar with if we're in an administrative role or special education or things like that. School districts must identify and serve every qualified handicapped person residing within the district's jurisdictional boundaries. And an important thing to understand with 504s, you cannot require parents to obtain a diagnosis and bring it to you. So if you tell your parents who come to you and say, hey, my kid has ADHD and I'd like them to be on a 504, you cannot require that the parents go to the doctor's office, get a doctor's note that says 504 accommodations or a student has ADHD and bring that back to you to provide them with a 504 plan. Asking parents to go and get a diagnosis opens the door to your district having to pay for that doctor bill. We can't require this. Parents have the duty to inform us of a disability, and it is on us to do the assessments and the follow-up thereafter. The burden of proof is not on the parents. So who qualifies for Section 504 plans? Well, under the Federal Code of Regulations, handicapped persons, anyone who has a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities, they have record of such an impairment or they are regarded as having such an impairment. And in this circumstance, a physical impairment can be a psychological disorder condition, cosmetic disfigurement, anatomical loss affecting one or more of the following body systems, such as the neurological, musculoskeletal, special sense organs, respiratory, including speech organs, cardiovascular, reproductive, digestive, the list goes on. And then any mental or physical disorders, such as mental retardation, organic brain syndrome, emotional mental illness, and specific learning disabilities. And then major life activity means functions such as caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, working. And if they have a record of this impairment, they have a history, or they have been misclassified as having a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Oh, come on. All right, so what is a physical or mental impairment for us? Per Section 504, a person is disabled if they have a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities, has a record, or is regarded as having such an impairment. This can be all of those things that we talked about on the previous slide. It doesn't set forth a list of specific diseases and conditions that constitute physical or mental impairments because of the difficulty ensuring comprehensiveness of a list, but you kind of get the gist of if they fall under any of these issues, these areas, they could be considered to have a physical or mental impairment. So in the case of Beyond SST, one of the nice things that we have, if you're utilizing Beyond SST with the 504 forms in place, we give you the steps right there. Physical or mental impairment, which substantially limits one or more major life activities, yes or no. This isn't an exhaustive list, but it's a pretty good list for when we're dealing with students in an educational setting. So if they do have a mental or physical impairment, you'll check yes. And then we're going to figure out what their physical or mental impairment is going to be. If it's a psychological disorder, if it's a cosmetic disfigurement or an anatomical loss, or if they have a mental or psychological disorder, we're going to document what the issue is, and we're going to describe the specifics of the impairment and anything that we use to get to that answer. And this becomes very important when we get to the eligibility section of a 504. There are 3 components that are required to qualify. This is step 1. They have a mental impairment or a physical disability. And so if you can check yes on here, they're on their way to getting a 504 plan. So what do we consider substantial? The determination of substantial limitation is made on a case-by-case basis for each individual student. So based on OCR guidance and decisions, it's a student who suffers from a substantial limitation will be unable to perform a major life activity the average person in the general populace could do. And it should significantly restrict as to the condition, manner, or duration under which they can perform that major life activity as compared to the condition, manner, or duration under which somebody else should be able to complete that activity. So let's look at this physical mental impairment, which substantially limits one or more major life activities. Again, going back to the 504 forms, which have been reviewed by different attorneys and meet OCR compliance and beyond SST, the second question we're asking is, does that mental or physical impairment limit a major life activity? Yes or no? If it limits a major life activity, we're going to select which major life activity it is. You know, it could be caring for oneself, it could be walking, it could be seeing, it could be hearing, breathing, learning, sleeping, thinking, concentrating, communicating. Whatever it is, you want to check those boxes. You want to mark off what it is. And if those boxes aren't there, then you'll document it in the other section. And then again, use whatever data you collected or you had to answer that question. So we've got 2 questions. Yes, the student has a mental or physical impairment, and that physical or mental impairment limits a major life activity. So things to take into consideration in life activities, even if this is only going to substantially limit an individual for a short time, you know, the student may have a broken leg or the student is pregnant, they may still qualify for a 504 plan if they are substantially limited for a duration that would normally last longer than it takes to create a 504 plan. So if their leg is going to be broken, or they're going to be pregnant, or they've got a temporary disability that's going to last more than 2 months, you should consider that they would qualify for a 504 plan. Something important to take into consideration while we are dealing with the COVID world that we are living in, we shouldn't remove school-based accommodations and supports during our full distance learning or hybrid instruction. If the student is going to qualify for a 504, we want to document that they are not that they are not at an in-person or on-campus setting, but that they are currently in a distance learning setting, so that you don't have to keep going back and forth. So going back to those special factors. So if they have a physical or mental impairment, which substantially limits one or more major life activities, the last question we want to know is, are they unable to perform that activity as the same age grade level peers unless they have mitigation measures? If you can click yes, and describe what you use to get to that resolution, the student qualifies for a 504 plan. If any of those 3 questions are a no, the student does not qualify for a 504 plan under OCR guidelines. They have to have a physical or mental disability. It has to limit them to a substantial degree, and it has to limit them to such a degree that they cannot perform the same type of things as same grade age level peers. What else we need to take into consideration? Because we think about 504 plans and we think in the classroom and we think during the school day and we think I have to provide them accommodations while they're at lunch. I have to provide them accommodations while they're in the classroom, while they're in the music class. But they have to have equal opportunity for participation, which means reasonable accommodations have to be necessary. When we're talking about sports teams or after school extracurriculars, it doesn't guarantee them a spot, but you can't say, no, you can't try out for the football team because you're in a wheelchair. No, you can't do this because you have ADHD. No, you don't get to play on the soccer team because I don't want to deal with your hyperactivity. Schools have to allow a modification unless it fundamentally alters the nature of the activity or provides students an unfair advantage over their non-disabled peers. And the legal obligation for 504 supersedes any rules established by associations or clubs. So I'll provide an example. Actually, a very good friend of mine, her son has cerebral palsy, and he tried out for the football team and he made the team, but he needs about 10 minutes longer than everybody else to get dressed out in the locker room. He's got some issues with his feet as part of his cerebral palsy. And if you're late to the field dressing out, you have to do penalties. You have to do bear crawls. You have to do burpees. You have to do, coach has penalties. Those penalties could not apply to him. His accommodation allowed him extra time to get dressed. That did not give him an unfair advantage over his non-disabled peers. It just gave him the opportunity to have equal access to play on the football team as everybody else. If he wasn't a good enough football player, it wouldn't have guaranteed him a spot on the football team. All his 504 plan did was guarantee he couldn't be punished or face punitive issues because he wasn't meeting the same speed standards as the other students getting dressed and making it out to the field on time. Another example is, if you have a student who has diabetes and they're on a 504 plan through which they receive glucose or insulin during the school day, and you have a school treatment nurse there, if they want to participate in something after school, say a theater group, the school is required to provide those same services for the student after school as they would during the school day. So if the student has diabetes and they need a nurse on site because of it, if the student is going to be in a play after school, a nurse has to be on site at the school site during that time. You can't tell the student, no, you can't be in theater because we don't want to have a nurse stay after school. That is not real. That's not legal. It doesn't meet the standard. You have to provide the student with that nurse in order for them to participate in that extracurricular activity after school. These are just a couple vague examples of athletics and extracurriculars that you guys can kind of see how 504 plays into not just classroom, but outside of the classroom. So where do we start? So with 504s, these are very similar to IEPs as far as we have to test a student. So if you have a parent who wants a 504 or you'd like to offer the student a 504, parents will either accept or decline the assessment plan. So if parents don't want to do the 504 assessment and you guys are okay with them not having a 504 assessment, we offer SST interventions if appropriate. If the student or the parent say, yes, we need to go forward, and the team says, yes, we need to go forward with assessing for a 504, like an IEP, you have to have parents' permission to assess the student for a 504 plan. If parents are declining that assessment and the school feels very strongly that the student needs a 504, you can take the due process route like you would for a student who needs to be on an IEP and the parents are declining. If you find that you're getting to that point where you need to go through due process because you feel very strongly the student needs to be on a 504 plan and the parents are declining that, you need to contact whoever your district or your school site 504 coordinator is and let them know we need to start going down that next path of due process. Like an IEP will provide parents a copy of their parent rights. And then in some circumstances, we want to obtain a release of medical information if it's needed. If mom says, hey, yeah, you can have access to the medical records, let's get that medical information form filled out and sent over. It's not always going to be available. It's not always going to be an option. If we can get that information, great. Just remember, you cannot require mom or dad or whoever holds ed rights take that child to the doctor and to get a formal diagnosis. All they had to do was provide you with the information that their child has a disability, and you have to go forward after that. So 504 assessment does require a parent guardian permission. In Beyond SST, we have a permission form, just like you would have a assessment plan in SACE for special education. We have an assessment form in Beyond SST for this initial assessment or reevaluation of a 504. And it basically tells the parents that under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, we're going to do an evaluation to see if the student has a physical or mental impairment that potentially limits their same functions as same grade level peers. If they're middle school or high school, we always want them to bring the child with them because it is the child's life. The child should have a say and be part of this. This is their plan. And then it kind of goes through what some of the examples of physical or mental impairments are and some examples of what those major life activities are that could be limited. And then it talks about how we're going to determine eligibility for 504. And so different things can be used for evaluation of a 504 plan. It doesn't have to be a formal assessment where you sit down with a whisk or you sit down and you go through different types of scales and assessments like we do special education. What you can use is observations, interviews, collection of data such as aptitude and achievement tests, teacher recommendations, physical condition. If you have the medical diagnostic information, great. If not, remember, you cannot ask for it. Social and cultural background information. Sometimes psychologists will provide behavior skills or rating scales, checklists. So it's a lot of that information that is used by the team to determine eligibility. Parents will either give permission or they won't give permission. You cannot assess the student without mom and dad or ed right holders' permission. With 504s, they are a little more vague in timeline compared to an IEP. We know that with an IEP, we get a request for assessment. We have 15 days to get an assessment plan. We have 60 days after the assessment plan assigned to determine eligibility. We have to hold an annual every year on the year, can't be late. We have to hold a triennial every 3 years, can't be late. OCR is a little bit different. So OCR likes to look at the time frame that's established in IDEA, but it's not steadfast. So we stick close to those IEP timelines. After we've gotten permission, we want 15 days to get that letter to the parents. After it's signed, we should have eligibility determined within about 60 days. And then you want to have a 504 review at least once a year. And then just like we do for IEPs, every 3 years, we need to reevaluate to see if the student is still eligible and will still qualify. Some of those medical conditions that a student has, they may not have forever. It may be something like a broken bone. It may be something like a pregnancy that's going to impact them for a time frame, but not long enough for them to stay on their 504 for the rest of their life. So when we talk about 504s, we like to talk about accommodations versus modifications. Changes in instruction or student output that minimize the impact, but don't alter or lower the course standard or expectation are our accommodations. These are things like taped lectures, decreasing the number of problems that are assigned, preferential seating for the student. All of this is accommodating the student, but it is not changing or lowering the standard of what we expect from them. We're just giving them that extra help, that extra accommodation. Modifications will adjust the instruction so that it minimizes the impact of the disability and it alters or changes and lowers the standard course expectations. This could be something like, the modification is we have a 5th grader, but we're using 1st grade curriculum. We have lowered the standards, we have lowered the expectations. So there's a difference between accommodations and modifications. So there are 9 different types of curriculum adaptations that we can look at. Quantity, reducing the number of times the learner has to do something. The time, adapt the time allotted and the time that you allow for certain things. Maybe you give them a little more time to turn in an assignment. Maybe you give them a little more time on an assessment that other students wouldn't have without a disability. The level of support, increase the amount of personal assistance. Sometimes we assign buddies or we assign teaching assistants or peer tutors. Wouldn't necessarily be something we give to everybody, but for this student with a disability, maybe this is what they need. Adapt the way the instruction is delivered using different visual aids. Maybe they have books that have large text. They have concrete examples or they have hands-on activities. Adapt the skill level so that the learner can approach the work. So in your regular classroom setting, nobody else gets to use the calculator for the science class, but because this student has a disability that allows it, we're going to let them use a calculator to do these simple math problems in the science class. So you want to look at the difficulty in adapting the skill level. Output, adapt how the student can respond to instruction. And so I'm hoping my hyperlink works here because this is one of my favorite examples of how output can really impact. Let's see if it's going to work. And I hope you guys can see this. So I think that's probably one of my favorite examples of output output, how you can adapt how the student responds. You know, instead of having them write all of their answers down, give them a verbal quiz. Perhaps they have issues with handwriting or they have other issues. You're allowed to do things like that. Participation. Adapt the extent to which the learner is actively involved in the task. Instead of just having everybody sit there, have the student lead a group, have the student hold the globe at the front of the classroom while you guys talk about different countries. Alternate goals. Adapt the goals or outcome expectations while using the same material. For some students, this may be expecting them to locate the states, while others learn to locate the states and the capitals. And then substitute curriculum. Provide different instruction materials to meet the learner's individual goals. An example of this might be during a language lesson, you have a student who might be out learning toileting skills with an aid because they're not going to be learning that the language lesson that you have. It's more important that they learn those toileting skills. Those are types of curriculum adaptations that we can use. It is very important that we talk about and understand, and I don't know why my thing is wonky here, but case law. So case law is really important when we're talking about 504s. Doe v. Withers. So this is a landmark case, and you don't ever want to be the teacher whose name is now part of case law, where a disabled student with an accommodation for oral testing by the learning disabilities teacher in the resource room was denied his accommodation by the history teacher, Michael Withers. The court brief stated that all teachers but the defendant, Michael Withers, agreed to comply with the oral testing by the learning disabilities teacher in the resource room. Michael Withers eventually lost the case and was held personally liable for damages and denial of faith and was ordered to pay $5,000 in compensation damages and $10,000 in punitive damages. So really what it came down to was the teacher knew that there was a 504 in place, elected to not follow the 504 accommodations, and the parents sued. And the parents can sue the district and the parents can sue the teachers directly. And this is one of those instances where I think it's really important that as a district, as an administrator, as a 504 coordinator at a site level, you do your best to make sure that all of your teachers are aware and informed and understand that there is a 504 in place, that if there are substitutes who are filling in and covering, that they understand that there is a 504 in place and that they have to provide those accommodations. In Beyond SST, you can print out the 504s, you can bulk print them. The teachers are all assigned, so they have their caseload that they can open up and see, you know, these are all of my students, these are all of my students on a 504. Best practice is to send an email to all of your teachers and tell them, you know, please read and review the 504 plans that you have on your Beyond SST caseload. Send the email with a read receipt. You have now covered your liability side of it and said, I made my teachers aware of a 504. If they choose not to provide those accommodations to a student, the liability is now on them, along with any fiscal responsibility that comes from a lawsuit. So it's really important that we understand that it's not something where it's just the school that's going to be sued if we violate that 504. Individual teachers can be sued for violating a student's 504. Case law, Mark H. v. Hamanto. The Federal Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals recently reaffirmed that a student may establish a claim for damages under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act if a school district violates Section 504 intentionally or with deliberate indifference. This case serves as a reminder that in addition to filing a due process complaint under the Individuals with Disability Education Act, a student may also be able to sue for damages under Section 504 if a school district fails to provide special education services and or develop an appropriate IEP. So if they can sue us for not providing an IEP, they can sue us for not providing a 504 if it is appropriate. This is again where it's important that we go through, do you qualify? Do you meet all of the qualification requirements? Do we have your 504 accommodations in place? And once we have those in place, are we providing those accommodations as we said we would? So it's important to know that with our 504 students, they have the same rights as special education students. If they have discipline issues and we're suspending them, by the time we get to that day 11 of suspension, you have to do a manifestation determination to decide and determine if these suspensions are a direct result of the disability that they are covered under their 504. There's no disciplinary changes in placement due to behaviors that are caused by a disability. So if a student has a 504 for ADHD We can't just suspend them or we can't place them in a different classroom because of their ADHD. It's just like our special education students. We have to follow those rules of the law. So I know that says questions, but we're going to bop out of that and we're going to go actually into the live Beyond SST. If I could remember my password. Because I think it's important too that we understand and acknowledge when we're looking at students who are on a 504 plan, you can go in here and just find all of your students who are 504 in progress and see all of them. I think it's really important that when you're looking at that 504 plan and you're looking at the forms within it, that you understand that all of this information travels from one school to the next school to the next school, no matter where the student moves, as long as that district is utilizing Beyond SST or it's within your own district and your kids are moving from one school to the next. So we have 42 schools in our district and we have a lot of movement. A lot of our kids are moving around in the middle of the school year, at the end of every school year. We are constantly moving kids between elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools, in addition to matriculating students from 6th grade to 7th grade, 8th grade to 9th grade. And when you have those types of movements, you need to have 504 meetings to adjust the accommodations. And so when you open up and you look at an accommodation plan, in here we'll decide if it's an initial or if it's a review or if it's something else. And we can look at if it's an annual or periodic or if it's a parent request, and we put in the dates. But then when you actually start creating the accommodations, in here, you can pick what the subject area is for the student, what kind of accommodations we're going to be providing for them. And then, environmental or instructional accommodations, something to be very aware of when you are providing your accommodations and you're documenting these.
Hey, Melissa, let me interrupt you for just a
Go ahead.
second. We're not seeing your screen. We're still seeing your PowerPoint.
Okay, let's try this again. I love it when it does this. How about now?
There we go. Much better.
Woohoo! Okay, so guys, this is the 504 form in Beyond SST. If you're not already using it, this is pretty awesome. So it has the purpose of the meeting, and then you have your accommodations here, and you can pick what subject those accommodations are relevant for. If it's just for one specific subject, if it's for all the subjects. And then it's a lot of check boxes. So this is really nice. Best practice, administration is the only one who should have permission to edit 504 forms, because once this 504 form is implemented and parents have signed off, if a teacher goes in and makes changes and the parents sign off, then you're legally obligated to provide whatever's on there. We had a teacher who was changing 504s and put something like student could go home when they were tired, and our middle school kid, he was going home 10 minutes after the bell rang to start the day because that was in his 504 plan and there was nothing we could do. So just be careful who you're giving permissions to if you're utilizing this system. But within here, when you have something like tests and quizzes, and you say that they can be read aloud, that means every single test and quiz can be read aloud. You may want to put notes in the comment section that say, only these tests are read aloud. Only tests during this time are read aloud. When we're looking at homework, extended time to complete assignments. Maybe you want to put sorry, and I'm typing here and I can't talk and do it at the same time. Maybe you want to put something like there's a 2-week deadline extension after the assignments are due. Because if you don't put in clarifying details, like you only have 2 weeks after everybody else has to turn stuff in to complete your assignment, and you just leave it as extended time, it is very open to interpretation. You could be getting ready to wrap up that grade book for the end of the school year, and this student turns in 45 missing assignments. And the argument is, well, you said I had extended time. You never said I had to turn it in 2 weeks. So my 504 says extended time. You have to grade all of that and give me credit for it because I have a 504 and my 504 says so. And if you don't, I'm going to sue you. So it's important when we're creating accommodations that we have intent in how we document them, and that we have timeframes, and that we are very purposeful in what those accommodations are going to be. And you can see within here, there's lots of different options and lots of different things, and you can create accommodations as many different accommodations as you want for different subjects. And if you don't want all of these, we just hit the delete and those accommodations will go away. But then we get down to state testing. And if they have testing without accommodations, you won't see anything. And I'm going to get rid of the accommodations for all of my kids here. So these kids all have testing, or the student has testing without accommodations for ELA, for math, for science, for physical fitness. There's no accommodations. But let's talk about, maybe the student does need accommodations for math. And so we're going to do with testing accommodations. You can go in and you can select whatever supports you think the student needs. And I'm just going to check a bunch of random boxes in here because, who doesn't want all of these great random testing accommodations if they have to sit in the classroom and take a bunch of tests? Maybe that's the one good thing about COVID, right? No standardized tests this last year. And then once you've selected your accommodations, when you hit OK, what you'll see is it tells you which accommodations are valid for which test. So if they're taking the SBAC with designated supports embedded, all of these accommodations can be applied. If they're taking it with non-embedded accommodations, these are the accommodations that they can have. And so what's really amazing about this is not only do you have the accommodations right there, but you can utilize this in the TOMS report to upload so that all of the accommodations are already taken care of. And I don't do that. We have an amazing man named Hiskia in our district who does all of that stuff for us. But it's there. And so the testing and accommodations are taken care of. And you have it, it's already done. And it does it for science, it does it for physical fitness. And then you can see there's all of these. So this is all part of their accommodation plan. This becomes that legal document that we have to adhere to. And teachers have access to go in and just pull up their 504s and look at their kids in the software. You can print it out and put it in the subfolder if you need to put it in the subfolder so that the substitute is aware if the teacher hasn't included in their lesson plan that Johnny has a 504 plan and he should have these things done during this lesson today. So those are some of the advantages to having that 504 plan documented within here. And then you have the options to take notes just like you do in SACE. But all of this is nice, it's tidy, it's legal. Everything is in one place. Everybody can be held accountable. You have historical copies of it for years and years and years stored in the student history of the software. So if there is ever an issue or you have to contact, an attorney contacts you for copies, you have all of those documents available to you. I don't want to go too crazy. And I know, Matthew, I saw a lot of things popping up in QA, and I don't know if there's a lot of stuff in the chat. I haven't really been monitoring it. But I did want to give the opportunity for us to answer those questions in case it reminds me of anything and we go down another rabbit hole.
Yeah, so there are a few questions here in the chat. First of all, back to the TOMS. Does it communicate with TOMS or do we have to upload? It does export a report that is in the correct format. Melissa, I think you know what I'm talking about there.
Yes, I've got it highlighted on my screen right here.
Yep.
And then that gets uploaded.
Yes, the export. Yeah, the export should all be in the correct format, ready for the TOMS website.
So you don't have to go through and check all the boxes. You can just export, download and upload, and then your TOMS is done for your accommodations.
Yeah, so a few more questions here. Is Beyond SST something we'll use in addition to our student information system? Yes, absolutely. Beyond SST is a supplement to your student information system. So you will only track SST and 504 information within Beyond SST.
Think of Beyond SST as your tier 2, tier 3 database. It tracks all of your students who are in pre-SST, who are in that tier 2 SST process. And then it tracks all of your students who are in that tier 3 SST process where they're on a formal SST or they're on a 504. And then SACE actually has your tier 3 IEP students in their system. And SST Online and SACE talk to each other. So it's not a one-stop shop, but it's a one company shop, I guess, where everything is together and they do communicate really well with each other. So
good question here related to the the current global situation, is the district required to hold a 504 meeting and obtain signatures during this COVID-19?
Yes, yes, you are still required to hold 504 meetings, and you are still required to have those signed. You can do verbal consent over the phone for the most part, and it doesn't hold you up. But until the e-sign feature is finished, and it's coming. If you're using SACE, you know how great e-sign is. You just send the packet out, everybody does their electronic signature, and it comes back and it's a signed document. E-sign is coming for Beyond SST for the 504 side first, and then the SST side next. Thank you, Matt. You guys and the programmers are amazing. In the meantime, you can download. So when you are done with this form, you can download the form, and you can download it in English or Spanish, which is great for your Spanish speaking families. You guys don't have to have this translated anymore. We have a full-time translator who does all of our IEP forms and stuff like that. She may be out of a job pretty soon. But you can print this or you can download this. And then what we have been doing in our district until we get e-sign taken care of is we have been using DocuSign and just sending it via DocuSign to the families, or we have been sending it through the mail with a postage paid return envelope, but you do still have to have signatures on it.
Here's an interesting question. Can a parent request an accommodation related to grade weighting? So their child has an anxiety disorder. The student earns A's and B's on all his classwork, but his test scores are only 20 to 40%. So the student gets an F in the class. So
I'm not sure if that might change up the way that the accommodation is. It could become more of a modification as opposed to an accommodation, which could impact graduation and things like that. I would honestly, with that question, because I don't have the answer, double check with your district's legal team and just ask your district's legal team, if we do this, is it acceptable? Is this an acceptable accommodation? That's one of those that I'm not comfortable giving you a yes, no answer on.
So another question from the chat here. Who is responsible for actually completing the 504 plan?
That's a great question. It's school site based. I mean, each district, each school needs to come up with their own plan. In our district, we have a pretty good policy and procedure in place. All of our 504s have to be reviewed for every single student in the district by September 30th. Because we have new teachers, the kids are in a new classroom, the kids may have gone to the next school, they may be at the middle school now, they may be at the high school now, and the accommodation will change every time they move and go into a new grade or they go into a new school. Our administrative team, either an assistant principal or principal at the elementary school, has to be the one who leads our accommodation, our 504 meetings. At our secondary, at our high schools, it will either be an administrator or it will be their counselor who lead it. And then we always invite our psychologist. We always invite the classroom teachers that are going to be implementing the 504 and the parents.
Great. Is Beyond SST a part of SACE? No, Beyond SST, it's by the same developers, CodeStack, but it's not a part of the same program. They are two separate programs. Having said that, they do communicate with one another. So when you refer a student, you can actually make a referral from Beyond SST to SACE, to special education. And when you make that referral, the documents within Beyond SST go over to SACE. So the folks who are doing that evaluation in SACE can see those SST documents. Melissa, you're probably a little bit more familiar with that process.
Yeah, so what I love about this, and it's kind of deviating away from 504, but at the same time, it's really part of the software itself. Because Beyond SST and SACE communicate with each other, and we have implemented a policy that requires, even when parents request a special education assessment, we hold an SST in that first 15 days. We do the same thing if they request a 504. We hold an SST in the first 15 days and provide them with the options and explain what assessment really looks like. We have been able to reduce the number of assessments that we're doing. And we have also been able to increase the number of students who qualify and decrease the number of students who do not qualify using the referral process, where Beyond SST actually talks to SACE and SACE gets the Beyond SST documents, and then we make the referral process that way. And we have students who go from pre-SST to SST to 504. The 504 isn't cutting it. They get referred over for special education, and it all goes through the SST until they're referred, and then it's all of a sudden it's in SACE. And so the systems do go talk to each other, and they talk to each other in the fact too that if the student doesn't qualify for an IEP in SACE, you can actually send a message back to Beyond SST that, you know, the student didn't qualify, notifying that school site that they either need to pursue assessment for a 504 because they feel like that's needed, or they need to put that student on an SST because the special education qualification didn't come through and they still need some kind of a support.
A couple more questions about Beyond SST. You say one of the folks says their district uses SACE, but not Beyond SST. Like I said, they are two separate programs. So if you would like to look into having a contract for Beyond SST, I'll put the support email address in the chat. It's sstsupport@sjcoe.net. And we'd be happy to give you a presentation, a demo, walk you through the Beyond SST program. So yep, send us an email at any time. We'll be happy to show you the program.
So with the 504s, the other thing that you guys can see in here, I mean, we have a meeting invitation and notice that goes to the parent telling them, just like we would for an IEP, we're looking at them for a possible referral for 504. We're just doing their annual. The parent permission form, I kind of showed you a little bit on the slideshow. The eligibility documentation. So this is that one that, you know, this gives you the 504, or this says, no, you don't get the 504. This is, you know, you can just put in information, background information here as needed. But then when we actually get down to it, the three big questions: does the student have a mental or physical impairment? Yes or no? Does that mental or physical impairment limit a major life activity? Yes or no? And is that major life activity limiting to such a substantial degree that the student can't do the same things as comparable to grade age level peers without mitigation measures? Yes or no? If all of those are yes, the student meets eligibility criteria, they pass go, they get a 504 plan. If one of those checkboxes is no, the student doesn't get a 504. We offer them SST interventions instead, and we go that route for their support. But it's all documented here in this nice, clean document. And if they get to pass go and collect $200 or a 504 plan, you write out their accommodation plan in here. If you have that issue where it comes down to, we are suspending this kid, we are on suspension number 11 and we have to do a manifest, the documents are in here for your manifestation. If the student has behavioral issues, you have a behavior intervention plan that can be completed here. I would definitely recommend, if you're doing a BIP for a student on a 504, you involve your school psychologist. The parent rights are in here. There's a notes page, just like you would have in an IEP, where you would document the notes of the meeting. And then in a year, you go back and you review everything, you make updates as needed, and the student's 504 plan just continues to follow them until they either exit or graduate.
Now, here's a related question. When does a student age out of 504?
They don't. You can take your 504 with you. You can take it with you to college. If you're working for someone that receives federal assistance, federal funding, your 504 plan can follow you there as well.
And do all these forms need to be completed?
So the only forms that have to be completed would be the accommodation plan and the eligibility documentation. If you're going to assess the student, you need the parent permission form for them to assess. You need the eligibility documentation to determine eligibility, and then you need the accommodation plan if the student qualifies. If the student is coming to you from outside of your district with a accommodation plan in place, the only thing you would need to do is update the accommodation plan with what your school can provide. And that's great when you get it from another school district. We have it in Visalia Unified. Cutler-Orosi, which is a school district just down the street from us, uses Beyond SST. So when our kids go back and forth, if our students go to them or their students come to us, we get the 504 plan already built, and we just have to tweak it to what our district is willing to provide, or they have to make adjustments to what their district can provide. And sometimes you'll see accommodation plans that come from other districts that are a little wonky. Like we had one where the child had to have a pulse oximeter and their oxygen level had to be checked every day before they could go out to recess. And our district office, our director of health and student services said, no, we can't provide that accommodation, find something else. And so we had to rewrite our accommodation plan based off of what we could provide accommodation for. But that's really, I mean, the forms that you need are very limited once you get a student on a 504.
We've got just a few minutes left for questions. Here's an interesting question from the chat here, wanting a little bit more information about families that request a 504 plan, but who do not provide any medical diagnosis and who do not disclose a mental or physical impairment. So this recently happened and the evaluation showed that the student did not qualify.
So if they don't qualify, they're not going to qualify if parents don't have any information to provide to you, if they don't have a medical doctor, if they don't have a diagnosis. They should be able to provide you with information. They don't have to, the burden of proof is not on them. It will help them. But when we talk about ways that we determine eligibility, it's this section of the parent permission form right here. Observations, interviews, collection of data such as aptitude and achievement tests, teacher recommendations, physical condition, medical diagnostics, social cultural background, behavior rating scales. If parents were unable to provide you with a medical diagnosis from a doctor and you did all of this and didn't find that the student met the requirements for a 504, then I'm sorry, mom and dad, your child doesn't meet the requirements based under the evaluations that we conducted. It is on them. If they want to go and get a doctor's note, don't tell them to, but if they come back with a doctor's note, you do everything again. And maybe the same results come back, maybe different results come back. We do see periodically parents that, you know, they work the system. I didn't get the IEP that I wanted. I want a 504 as a consolation prize. My kid's getting ready to go to college. They have ADHD. I don't want them to struggle. So I want a 504 right now for test anxiety because they're going to go to college and I know it'll follow them to college, even though they have been fine their entire academic career up until their senior year. And we know those parents are out there and they know the system. And unfortunately, I mean, I don't know if it's unfortunate or fortunate, but parents are getting really savvy. They're looking at advocates. There's all kinds of resources on the internet. So they know what their rights are.
All right, great. Well, looks like we're just about out of time. There were a couple more questions. If we didn't answer your question now, we will try to send out some information answering all the questions. We're recording all of these chats, so we're going to make sure everyone's question gets answered. Otherwise, thank you everyone for coming this afternoon. Thank you very, very much, Melissa. The great session. And unless there are any more questions, again, thank you all very much for attending.
Bye, guys.